Between December 2007 and May 2008, 3 wrongfully convicted men were exonerated from North Carolina's death row after spending a combined time of over 40 years waiting for their execution dates. All murder charges against Jonathan Hoffman, Edward Chapman, and Levon Jones were dismissed after findings that included prosecutorial misconduct, weak evidence, false testimony by witnesses, and perjury by investigators. Edward found out about his exoneration just minutes before his release from Central Prison.
I was in my room and officer at Chapman said, Sarge said, pack up, you leaving. I said, man, I've been packed for 14 years, I ain't never unpacked. And I'm thinking I'm going to safekeeping because when you get a new trial, they move you off death row to safekeeping. They put me in the little car within the gate and they drive me out of that gate to another one, to the parking lot. And it was really at that point that I knew I was going home because I thought it was still a joke. I'm looking at my surroundings, I can actually feel fresh air, the weight was gone. I just wanted to get out and run.
But how did Edward end up sentenced to death for 2 murders? His story starts in the southeast side neighborhoods of Hickory, North Carolina, where he was born.
My family struggled like anybody else's, but they were hard-working people. When I got around 17 and 18, I started experiencing with, drugs. And I went to New York in '88, stayed up there in '89 with my girlfriend, Gwen, the mother of my children. And then I came back down and I started a job at King Hickory Furniture. And then I just, fell in hard times. I started messing with the hard stuff. Crack cocaine. That went on for a while and I got arrested, charged with 2 first-degree murders.
On New Year's Eve at the age of 25, he was arrested for the murder of Betty Jean Ramser, one of 2 women whose bodies had been discovered earlier that year in abandoned houses close to where he lived. Edward knew both victims but denied having anything to do with their murders. While in jail, he was also charged with the murder of Tanine Conley.
It's a frightening feeling because here it is, you're sitting there, you're telling these people, I did not do it. I did not do it. And the first thing you're saying, well, I've heard it before. I've heard it 1,000 times. And I guess they look at your past and they were like, well, you're not credible. Why should I believe you?
Edward was tried for both women's murders later that year and was sentenced to death for each of them.
When the jury said, we find the defendant Glenn Edward Chapman guilty of first-degree murder and the death of Tanine Conley, Betty Ramser. I had an out-of-body experience. You hear people say that, but I literally had one because I was sitting there watching myself scream, asking for help. And wasn't nothing I can do. Nobody was listening to me. Nobody was listening to me.
In the early 1900s, between late 1800s, early 1900s, African Americans experienced the death penalty on the average of 1 per day. They were being hung on an average of 1 per day. Now, some of it was legal, some of it wasn't legal. There was so much hanging that Billie Holiday ended up writing a song called Strange Fruit. And it described black bodies swinging in trees and people were trumped up on all kinds of charges.
A 2005 study on lynching and the death penalty suggests that states that sentence the most criminals to death also tend to be the states that had the most lynchings in the past.
Every homicide is a terrible thing, but typically neither prosecutors nor juries give death in most homicide cases. Indeed, in this country there's some 20,000 homicides a year, and yet fewer than 1,000 or 1,500 receive death sentences. So the vast majority do not, and that's true in North Carolina as well.
The U.S. General Accounting Office reports a pattern of evidence indicating racial disparities in charging, sentencing, and imposition of the death penalty.
Are we being even-handed? Are we identifying the very worst among the worst and giving the death sentence to them alone? And what we find is that when we look at that question, that those who've killed whites particularly seem to be overrepresented on death row, more of them given death sentences than in other cases.
In North Carolina, the odds of getting the death penalty increased by 3.5 times if you were a person convicted of killing a white person. In Edwards' case and in the other two most recent North Carolina exonerated men's cases, at least one of the victims was white, and one of their trials had an all-white jury. Racial bias, conscious or not, often affects jury decisions. A white juror in a North Carolina case admitted bigotry influenced his decision to sentence a black man to death, and openly used the word nigger to refer to African Americans.
For the first 3 years, I actually relived it over and over and over again. All it did was make me cry because I didn't have nobody in my corner. And then I just decided that I was gonna just stop the pity. Only thing I can do is do as much as I can to help myself.
He started writing letters to people about his innocence and asked for their help.
DNA experts, pathologists, psychologists, forensic investigators, lawyers, anybody that I thought that could possibly give me some answers.
In 2002, he got the attention of attorney Frank Goldsmith, who assembled a team to investigate Edwards' case. Even though a jury convicted him beyond a reasonable doubt, findings of withheld evidence, ineffective counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, perjury by the lead investigator, and a report that one of the victims likely died from a drug overdose, led to the dismissal of all murder charges against him on April 2nd of last year. Edwards' 14-year-long ordeal on death row came to an end, the longest time ever of any North Carolina death row inmate released because of innocence. Today, Edward is happy to be working in a hotel in Asheville and rebuilding a new life, but is still concerned about other people in prison.
Race still plays a role in today's society. It's not gonna go away. We just found better ways of hiding it. What we gotta do is learn to unmask it, stop denying that it's a problem, and start taking the chances of going up there and finding a solution to do away with it.
North Carolina Representative Larry Wamble and others have introduced new legislation aimed at reducing racial disparities in the state's capital punishment system. House Bill 472 and Senate Bill 461, known as the North Carolina Racial Justice Act, would allow a person accused of a capital crime to show if race played a part in the prosecutor's decision to seek the death penalty.
We need to do all we can to make sure that there's fairness and that there's equality and that there's equity in our judicial system.
The Racial Justice Act is the device that would let us know for certain that we're not using race as a factor, or else if we discover it somehow, give us a way to rid it so that the system will be full of integrity and not distorted.
The Racial Justice Act would allow a defendant to present statistical evidence or other evidence to help prove that race was a significant factor in seeking his death sentence.
The burden is upon the defendant to present that information and to prove that information, and it's up to the judge whether the judge wants to accept that or not during the deliberation of the trial.
The Racial Justice Act would never keep someone from being death sentenced on statistics alone, but it would turn to the state at a certain point and say, this looks likely enough now that you need to explain to the judge why it is this person is getting death when so many others similarly situated have not received that sentence.
If a defendant succeeded in establishing his claim that race was a basis for his death sentence, the court could impose a sentence of life without the possibility of parole.
If there's ever been a time we need fusion politics, it's right now, where people need to come together across racial lines, across party lines. Even if you're a proponent of the death penalty, then surely you want every potential instance of flaw and failure to be taken out of the system.
For me, it's less a reflection adversely on North Carolina and its people than it is a reflection positively on where we aspire to go.